At the César Awards ceremony on February 23, 2024, actress Judith Godrèche delivered a speech entitled, "I am speaking to you, but I cannot hear you." In it, she denounces sexual violence in French cinema. The video of her address quickly spread across social media, and when I listen to it, there is something about it that keeps me on the edge of my seat.
For some time now, I have been speaking, but I cannot hear you. Or barely. Where are you? What are you saying? A whisper, half a word. That would already be something, says Little Red Riding Hood.
Every word draws me in. She has that indescribable quality that makes you want to listen to her to the end, to nod along with everything she says. Charisma. I too want to speak like her, to have that little something that captures people's attention. But is it just a Judith Godrèche thing, a star thing, or the gift of a smooth talker? Or could I too, with my ordinary appearance, learn some tips and tricks to boost my charisma? How to be charismatic in 12 steps, thanks to Uniscope, the podcast from the University of Lausanne campus. I've made up my mind today. I'm going to become charismatic. Well, I don't really know where to start. I keep watching Judith Godrèche's video on repeat. I have a bit of a hunch about what makes her charismatic. She uses beautiful words, her voice is calm and confident, and then she says things that move me, that even bring a tear to my eye sometimes. But honestly, all of this is still pretty vague. Instead of relying on my fuzzy intuitions and half-baked theories, I need to talk to someone who can share their scientific knowledge about charisma with me. So, I'm going to knock on the office door of Tiffany Kreutschy, a PhD student in management in the Organizational Behavior Department at the University of Lausanne. She works with her supervisor, John Antonakis, on a topic that particularly interests me.
I'm interested in working on motivation, leadership, and more specifically, charisma.
First, I'd like to make sure my intuition is correct. So, I show her the video of Judith Godrèche.
A hint of humor. That would already be something, said Little Red Riding Hood.
Yes, no, it's very charismatic, and it uses techniques that we'll talk about later.
Techniques. Perfect. I'm on the right track. Tonight, I'll go to bed more charismatic or at least less clueless. Before discovering these techniques, I still need to understand the basics. Because actually, I keep talking about it, but I don't really know what charisma is. Tiffany Kreutschy has a ready-made definition.
So what is charisma? Well, charisma is actually a signal that the leader sends to their followers. This signal is based on values, symbolism, and is also connected to emotions. So now, how can we signal charisma? We can use verbal techniques and non-verbal techniques. And why would we do that? We signal charisma because followers, in fact, will be able to infer different characteristics about the leader from these signals, such as the leader's competence, intelligence, or confidence.
So, there is the leader on one side and the followers on the other. And between the two, a signal passes from one to the other. And that's what charisma is. She reveals to me that there are 9 of these verbal techniques of charisma. As she breaks them down for me, I immediately think of all those examples of speeches I had analyzed before meeting her. Before, I only had a gut feeling about what seemed charismatic or not. But now, I realize that these techniques are very often used by major public figures. So here are 9 techniques to implement in your speeches to become charismatic. First of all, there are 6 that are part of the framework or symbolism of the speech. In other words, they correspond to the way you deliver your text. The first 2 of these tactics are metaphors and stories. That's what I heard in Meryl Streep's video at the 2017 Golden Globes. To spread a message of inclusion, she shared the specific stories of 8 Hollywood actors and actresses.
Who are we? And, what is Hollywood? Anyway, it's just a bunch of people from other places. I was born and raised educated in the public schools of New Jersey. Viola was born in a sharecropper's cabin in South Carolina, came up in Central Park.
At the end of her speech, by the way, she concluded with a metaphor of the broken heart that she wishes to turn into art.
As my friend, the dear departed Princess Leia, once said to me, take your broken heart, make it into art. Thank you for your question.
So this is typically actually related to images that we form in our minds, to what we call mental visualizations. So for example, when we use a metaphor, we connect two domains that are generally not linked to each other in order to bring something new that can either help us understand something complex and have that eureka moment, or simply convey an emotion more powerfully.
Third technique to become a charisma powerhouse. Use contrasts in your speeches.
This means contrasting two ideas and clearly explaining what we aim for and what we do not.
André Malraux, Minister of Cultural Affairs in France during the 1960s, knew this. He used contrast in his tribute to resistance fighter Jean Moulin on December 19, 1964.
Enter here, Jean Moulin, with your terrible procession, with those who died in the cellars without speaking, like you, and even those who perhaps even more atrociously died after having spoken.
Those who did not speak, those who did speak, you can feel the contrast, and it sounds charismatic. The fourth technique, the rule of three.
The idea is to have three elements because it gives a sense of a complete list, but it's also easier to remember.
I remember there were some in Judith Godrèche's speech at the César Awards. She listed 3 things that one can lose by speaking out about sexual assault.
I know it's scary. Losing grants, losing roles, losing your job. Me too. I'm scared.
It's already starting to be a lot to remember. I don't know if charisma is really for me. Come on, let's hang in there. Fifth technique, repetition.
If we take, for example, Martin Luther King's speech, I have a dream, he uses I have a dream, then he talks about something, then I have a dream, he talks about something else. And that's something that gives rhythm to his speech.
Just as I have a dream.
The last framing technique, I'll let you guess it with the speech by activist Greta Thunberg at the 2019 United Nations Climate Action Summit.
Ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
Did you figure it out? Here's a little hint. I just used it as well.
Rhetorical questions are questions you ask without really expecting an answer. And that allows you to engage the audience. People are intrigued. They start asking themselves questions.
So, metaphor, story, contrast, list of 3, repetition, and rhetorical question.
That's the part related to framing. And now the substance part is more about the purpose of a speech, an idea, and so on. And that's connected to moral values. We express moral values, what we think people should do or how the world should be.
Fortunately, there are only 3 charismatic techniques in this category. The first is the sense of togetherness.
What do we think our audience feels, and showing that we understand and can bring our audience closer to the leader, who can sometimes seem out of reach.
Like Charles de Gaulle, in his famous 1958 speech from Algiers, a moment that changed history.
I have understood you.
He understands us, so we feel closer to him. The next 2 techniques, which are also the last, are actually connected.
Next, we have everything related to ambitious goals. In fact, you need to set ambitious goals, show that they are specific and so on, and demonstrate that you are confident these goals can be achieved. This is very important.
So, on one hand, talk about an ambitious goal, for example, just to pick one at random, saving democracy, and on the other hand, show that even if it's a huge objective, it's still achievable, starting with something simple, like clapping your hands. This is the idea that the actor Vincent McCain shared in his speech at the César Awards ceremony at the beginning of the year.
It's truly wonderful that you're all here together to ultimately celebrate the magic of fiction and the experience of cinema in theaters. It's absolutely incredible, especially when I remember that fiction and theater was perhaps humanity's very first step toward democracy. During ancient Greece, after a performance, the audience didn't applaud the actresses and actors to congratulate them. No, they applauded them to drive away the souls, the ghosts that these actresses and actors had summoned through their performance. So I like to think that if you're all here tonight, it's perhaps to help chase away all those lingering ghosts and to truly celebrate a much better, brighter future together.
So here it is, my recipe for charisma. Take a speech and add metaphors, anecdotes, and contrasts. A few lists of 3 elements, some repetition, a rhetorical question here, a sense of togetherness there, and then an ambitious goal without forgetting to share the confidence that it can be achieved. And just like that, charisma appears. It's by taking these 9 techniques into account that researchers in organizational behavior have been able to establish a master charisma.
So yes, we also have an algorithm to measure charisma. It codes for each sentence the probability that it contains each of the 9 tactics, then adds these probabilities to give a kind of charisma score for a speech.
For example, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech gets a score of 7.4. That means that for every 10 sentences in the speech, on average, 7.5 charisma techniques are used. Judith Godrèche's speech at the César Awards, on the other hand, averages 4 techniques per 10 sentences.
But you should know that this algorithm, in fact, was actually programmed based on manual coding. So manual coding is also a process that is very precise, very specific. Not just any metaphor will be counted as a metaphor. We only count metaphors that are strong. If we take, for example, as dumb as a post, that's used in everyday language, so it won't count as a metaphor. We only consider original metaphors. It's the same for every tactic. There are clear rules that state which cases will be counted and which will not, to standardize coding and to actually train coders. The coding is very consistent between the different people who do the coding. Generally, about 85 to 90% of the coding is similar.
But couldn't all of this be cultural? Haven't we learned, after watching so many videos of celebrities, politicians, and American movies, to think it's cool when we add a metaphor or express an ambitious goal?
What you need to know is that, in fact, in most cultures, when people are asked what trait would be prototypical of a leader, charisma comes up very often. So already in general, that's something that is more or less observed. Then, from a scientific standpoint, and in terms of scientific evidence, what's interesting is that there was an experiment that actually tried to replicate the effect of charisma in these more Anglo-Saxon cultures, that is in the United States, but also in England. And in fact, they managed to replicate the effectiveness of charisma in speeches in Austria, France, India, and Mexico. So they still have contexts that are very different culturally. In itself, research shows these techniques are generalizable and effective. Now, if you ask me, one question we can raise is about dosage. That is, no one has done research on what is the optimal dosage of these techniques. Indeed, in American speeches, we are used to, so to speak, hearing more of these techniques than in a speech, for example, even in Switzerland. So dosage is a question. And it's interesting for future research.
So we'll keep that idea in mind for future research. For now, some studies are specifically trying to understand the effect of gender on charisma. Because in our patriarchal society, male leaders are generally perceived as more competent than women. But that's without taking charisma into account, which can restore the balance.
In a study by Reed Jensen and co-authors, in fact, they conducted research in which they exposed people to an image of a man or a woman, typically a politician. Then there was an image with a standard speech and an image with a charismatic speech. And in fact, they compared these different scenarios, and what they found is that there are typically issues, let's say, in estimating the competence, intelligence, and prototypicality of a leader without the charismatic speech. But the charismatic speech acts as what is called the great equalizer in English, which actually helps to counteract these biases. And women are perceived as just as competent, intelligent, and prototypical as men in these photos when accompanied by charismatic speech.
I had barely finished writing down the 9 techniques to learn how to rally crowds tomorrow with my charisma, when I realized we still haven't talked about non-verbal communication. So here are 3 additional techniques to become charismatic.
The first is everything related to facial expressions. So, for example, maintaining eye contact with the person you're speaking to, smiling. There are also gestures. For instance, raising your hand at a key moment in your speech, raising your fist, or even banging on the table in very specific cases to really emphasize the strength of your message. And then there's everything related to the tone of your voice. So do we modulate our voice or is it monotone? Now, you should know that the main part is really the verbal techniques. So the 9 rhetorical techniques we just talked about are the cake itself. These non-verbal techniques are really the icing and cherry on the cake in terms of proportion. If you say something that doesn't make sense or you're just talking nonsense while waving your hands, that's not what makes your speech charismatic.
So on top of thinking about my gesturing hands, the tone of my voice, my rhetorical questions, and my metaphors, I also have to think about the content of my message.
Because charisma is based on values, you really have to distinguish between signaling charisma, so using the tactics we've talked about, and the effect of charisma. So if the leader's values don't align at all with the followers' values, then the effect of charisma won't necessarily come through. We can take this example. If you go and ask in Oklahoma whether Trump is charismatic, people will find him very charismatic, knowing that Oklahoma has given him a lot of electoral college votes in recent years. But on the other hand, if you ask the same question in New York, where the values are very different from Trump's values, well, people there won't necessarily say that he's charismatic. So actually, when you take a stand and are charismatic, it's also a double-edged sword because you're exposing your values. And if the values align, you'll be perceived as charismatic and it will work in your favor. But if the values differ, it won't necessarily work.
That's a lot to put into practice. But before I start training, I still have one important question left. Can you learn to be charismatic?
There is a part of charisma that is innate. Some people will actually learn faster from other charismatic people. But it's a bit like IQ. When you think about it, education can improve your IQ. It's the same idea with charisma. You can learn charisma or at least refine your charisma to a certain extent. Marika Fanny and her co-author, who is also an alumna of Lausanne, conducted a field study with Swiss executives. They were taught how to be charismatic. They actually went through a kind of training to become charismatic. And after 3 months, indeed, the employees found them more inspiring and were able to convey more of that charisma.
During our discussion, I can't help but notice the gestures that accompany Tiffany Kreutschy's sentences. And I hear those metaphors, like the one about the cake and the icing, those rhetorical questions. Yes, she uses the techniques she just taught me. I can't help but ask her. I notice when you speak that you also use a lot of metaphors and so on. You tell me when you make gestures. Did you learn all of that?
I think that by learning to code, meaning to recognize metaphors and the rules for creating them, there's an occupational hazard. You become more familiar with these techniques. You notice them more when people speak, and you're more likely to use them yourself. That's a big part of charisma training. In fact, people are exposed to charisma. They're shown charismatic videos. We explain to them why it's charismatic. We also ask them why it's charismatic. And we have them work on texts, rework them with feedback on how to actually use these tactics. The more you use them, the more natural it becomes and the more likely you are to use them. It's true, I was exposed to a lot of these techniques by learning to identify them. My supervisor is also very charismatic, so there are a lot of factors that actually make us more attuned to these things.
Before I dive into this learning process, which seems pretty complex and time-consuming to me, I still wonder why I should even do it. It's true that having charisma is nice, but in everyday life, is it really useful? Or is it just a gimmick for an oversized ego?
There is some very interesting research currently being conducted by Neil Milstein, which actually suggests that it's like a champagne fountain. You think of those glasses stacked in tiers, and you see this champagne fountain, and you fill the top glass. And once it overflows, it fills the glasses below, and so on. The idea is that charisma, in a way, is contagious. So if the top leader of your company is very charismatic, the managers below will also be inspired to adopt some of that behavior and become more charismatic themselves, and in turn motivate the teams beneath them, and so on. So that's more on the individual level. On the organizational level, there's a study by Antonakis and colleagues that actually showed that charisma can motivate employees almost as much as financial incentives. And then there are studies that are broader in scope. So, for example, the study we're working on regarding American governors shows that having a more charismatic governor has real impact on the state's GDP. We collected speeches given before the election by the candidates who were running for governor. We used our machine and it gave us a charisma score. So we have these charisma scores. Now, you might say there could be plenty of other factors that explain who ends up in power and so on. It's not just about charisma, we agree on that. That's why we're focusing on elections that are extremely close. So when these elections are extremely close and someone wins with 50.1% of the votes versus 49.9%, it's almost a matter of luck, so it's almost random. It's a technique that is accepted in economics and used in political contexts of this kind, which actually allows us, in our case, to isolate the effect of charisma and to really see the impact of charisma on GDP without those other problematic factors. So what we see is that having a governor who is 10% above average will actually increase GDP over those 4 years in office by 3%. And so we also looked into potential mechanisms for how, in fact, we go from a charismatic governor to an increase in GDP. So one of the first leads we found is at the budget level. In fact, by being charismatic, a more persuasive governor secures larger budgets, which means he can invest more in his state. The second aspect is that a charismatic governor demonstrates confidence in the future, can be inspiring, and so on. This also has an effect at the business level. More businesses develop in that state.
So a charismatic governor increases a state's revenue, and his charisma also influences his chances of being elected, right?
So what's very important to know when we talk about elections is that there are factors like the economic factor, which is extremely important. And there are also factors related, for example, to which political party was in power before this election. So these are things that will already largely determine who will be elected. After that, charisma also does play a role, but typically in situations where things are actually ambiguous. For example, if you think about a situation where the economy is a bit shaky, but it's not really clear whether that's due to a COVID crisis, for instance, or to poor leadership. If these people run for office again and they are charismatic, we tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. This is from a paper that was discussed with Philippe Jacquard, who is also an alumnus of the University of Lausanne. And what they did is that they also worked on a model to predict elections by including charisma as a factor. So here, they typically did this for the last American elections, so Trump versus Kamala. And actually, if we take the model with only the economic factors and all the other controls that were included, then this is one of the models that has been developed over many years. In fact, it predicted that Trump would win 273 votes in the Electoral College, and by including charisma, it actually predicted 295 votes in the Electoral College. So in his case, the fact that he is slightly more charismatic than Kamala from an objective standpoint, and in terms of the tactics we've discussed, did indeed influence the prediction.
At the same time, I'm not very surprised that our electoral votes can be influenced by subjective elements like charisma, because we don't have a neat comparison chart that allows us to make an informed choice. Generally, we tend to vote more on instinct. But in science, that shouldn't be the case, right? That's what Tiffany Kreutschy wanted to investigate in a study she conducted as part of her PhD.
We know that charisma works, for example, to motivate employees and things like that, but we wondered if in the scientific world, and moreover, in a world that's mostly written, like scientific journals and articles, whether using charismatic techniques would also have an impact. So actually, we took articles from Leadership Quarterly, which is a journal about leadership and is interdisciplinary. We used our algorithm, which gives us the probability that each sentence contains one of the 9 tactics we discussed earlier. And actually, we looked at whether this score predicted citations while taking into account many other factors as controls, such as whether the paper is qualitative or quantitative, etc. Citations are something that is very important for researchers' careers, but also for institutions to receive additional research funding and so on. And so what we found is that indeed charismatic techniques do predict citations. A charismatic technique in the title, the title is just a sentence, it's not long. In fact, that already brings in 4 more citations.
So whether it's a country's GDP variation, the choice of a president, or the construction of scientific knowledge, charisma has a huge impact on our societies. So then, should we teach everyone to become charismatic to make the world a better place?
Good question. I think it depends, and again, it depends on the intentions. If we think, for example, about education, clearly, I would say we should teach it to all teachers because it could help students better understand the method, that could potentially help capture their attention. No research has been done in this area, but let's say intuitively could improve, for example, education and things like that. So in a sense, yes. On the other hand, well, it is indeed a double-edged sword, knowing that there may be harmful effects. It's very clear, let's say, that there have been cases of extremely charismatic people who have really led to catastrophic human disasters, truly terrible ones. It's a kind of tool that can be used, so it depends on your values, it depends on what you want to do with it, but in itself, it's a tool.
If I learn these 12 techniques and become super charismatic, I really need to think about what I say. Because in the digital age, it's not just going to affect my next door neighbor and my dance teacher. It can spread on social media, and very quickly.
Benjamin Tour, who is an alumnus of the University of Lausanne and a co-author, conducted a study on this. He looked into whether charisma and these charismatic techniques work on Twitter and in TED Talks, and he did indeed find that it had an impact, and quite a significant impact at that. So for tweets, for example, using one standard deviation more than the average of these charismatic techniques will increase the number of retweets by 65%. And if we look at TED Talks, using more tactics than the average by one standard deviation will have an impact of over 70% more views. So this clearly shows a significant and substantial impact as well in everything related to the world of social networks and online platforms.
Because of how algorithms work and cognitive biases on social networks, emotional and extreme content spreads faster and farther than more nuanced posts. Basically, angry, false, and shocking posts spread like wildfire. The consequence is a polarization of society. People's opinions end up becoming more extreme, and they turn against each other. But Tiffany Kreutschy has a plan. She intends to see if charisma could bring these opposing camps together. She has just received a grant from the Life Center to conduct research on this topic.
Absolutely. This is a project that is very close to my heart. I'm interested in the question of whether having a charismatic leader could also, in quotes, bring people together rather than divide them. We tend to think that it can divide them and push them to opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, if we think of someone like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King who brought people together rather than dividing them, there's really this question of whether we could use the tool of charisma to depolarize, to have more discussions actually, more consensus, and to have a platform to somehow bring together the extremes.
Charisma may simply be a signal from a leader to followers, conveyed through cues as subtle as a metaphor or the phrasing of an ambitious goal. Yet, when these small phrases are combined and amplified by tailored intonations and gestures, they make it easier to understand and remember a message, but also to identify with it more strongly. As a result, crowds are motivated by the emotions and values they embody, for better or for worse.
But wait, maybe here we could add a slightly inspiring anecdote, an example, something like that. Conclude with a rhetorical question.
Wait, let me try again. On February 24, 2024, during the César Award ceremony, Judith Godrèche spoke out against sexual assault in French cinema.
A whisper, half a word, that would already be something, said Little Red Riding Hood.
What has changed? 5 days later, she was heard by the Parliamentary Delegation for Women's Rights and Gender Equality in the Senate. There, she called for the creation of a commission of inquiry into sexist and sexual violence in the film industry. On May 2, 2024, the National Assembly agreed and established a commission of inquiry into this violence. In this story, it wasn't just charisma that made the difference, of course. But I don't think I'm the only one who got goosebumps and teared up while listening to her speech. She really managed to capture my attention. She was able to make things happen by finding the right metaphor. She knew how to pace her voice to make people listen. When it comes to making a difference, every little effort added together counts. So, did this make you want to refine your charisma and use it wisely to make a difference?
Now that's much more charismatic.
You have just listened to an episode of Uniscope, the podcast from the University of Lausanne, produced by Marion de Vevey. Thank you to Tiffany Kreutschy, PhD student at the Department of Organizational Behavior at Unil, for taking the time to charismatically explain her knowledge on the subject to me.